I know you love jazz music and you listen to it all the time, but when you do, it's moving by too fast, it's overwhelming, and you don't know what's going on. If this is happening, it's because you're still listening to jazz music like a fan and not like a musician. So today, I'm going to teach you a technique called layered listening that's going to make it so you can instantly understand whatever you listen to and you can play like you do. So the reason that jazz music can be so overwhelming to listen to at first is because there's so much going on and it has so much subtlety. Like a normal pop song, usually it's kind of about the melody and the words, and then everything around it is more like a frame. So if you kind of focus on, the subject of the picture, you kind of absorb the rest of the details in a really intuitive way. Jazz music is more like a conversation, but the kind of conversation where multiple people are talking at the same time, okay? So it's kind of like each person there, maybe the trumpet player is relating to the bass player and the bass player is relating to the pianist and the pianist is relating to the form of the song, and the saxophonist is listening to the whole band as a whole, right? There's so much layers, and in order to really understand jazz music, you kind of have to be able to digest those layers very quickly. And this really translates to the bandstand, right? Because if you really listen like a jazz musician, there's going to be certain things where you're kind of just like in on the joke. The other day I was playing at a jam session here in Seattle, and I played with these two young players who, man, they just played so well. And there's so many like little kind of cliches and nuances that we just intuitively did because we listen to the same music and we kind of hear the patterns, right? And we never met before, but we played like we did because we listen to the same music and we hear the things that happen underneath it, okay? And that's really why you need layered listening, okay? So layered listening is a technique I use with my students at the jazz school to kind of teach you the ability to hear all this nuance so that you can be in on the joke on the bandstand, okay? It's kind of like if you had a fancy painting at your house and every time you walked by it, you notice something different. The first time you notice, okay, the framing, it's kind of off center. The second time you notice the background, how it has a texture on one side and it's smooth on the other. The third time you notice, oh, it's actually made out of this kind of paint and it looks like he was using a small brush for that part and a big brush for that part, right? And then eventually over time, you gain a new understanding of that painting. And then when you go to an art museum, then you have an understanding of all those paintings too, because you went really deep with this one that was in your house, okay? That's what layered listening is. But instead of looking at a painting, we just listen to a particular song over and over again from a few different perspectives. And it's something I started doing when I was a kid, when I realized for the first time, like, oh, I can just like hear the bass if I just focus on it. Or, oh man, I could pick out the piano if I just kind of put my mind on the piano. And then there was all these things, all these jazz idiosyncrasies that I learned from doing that. Okay. So we're going to go ahead and jump right into an example. We're going to be listening to a song called Jean de Fleur by Grant Green. It's from his album Idle Moments. And we're going to start by just listening to the melody of the song with a really kind of broad, general, just kind of get a vibe for the tune as a whole. Okay. And I'm going to tell you what I heard after we listen to it. Let's go ahead. Okay, great, cool. That was a great first pass. Hopefully you heard some things there. Let me tell you what I heard. The first thing I'm listening for when I listen to a tune like this, and I actually started listening to this because I was playing this on a gig with a great guitarist named Luigi. Shout out Luigi in Seattle. Um, the first thing I hear in this is the form, okay? So the form of this song is actually a little strange. I don't know if you were kind of counting along, but it starts with this 14 bar phrase. Right? That goes through a couple sequences and it ends up being about 14 bars. There was an intro that was about 8 bars, just the hits, before they started playing the melody, right? And then we had this interlude, I would call it. That was kind of like a almost like a pedal point, or I think it was just between two chords. And it was the ba-da ba-da da ba-da ba-da da. That was about 8 bars, okay? And then there was a more linear section that I believe was 16 bars, okay? I say linear because it was more like, it wasn't hits, it was more like a melody that kept going forward. It sounded like ba do 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 ba da da. Another thing I noticed with that is that's a sequence, right? Which is where you have one melody and then it repeats like down a little bit. Ba 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 dee da da. Ba blue boo 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 bee yo da da ba da 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 do do dee boo 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 wee boo boo dee yo da. Right? So that's 16 bars and it kind of has that little sequence and then like a BC. It's like a AABC in it in and of itself, okay? The whole form so far is we have that 14 bar phrase, that's an A, and then we have that little interlude, ba da 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 da, that's a B, right? And then we have the C section, which is that more linear part that I was talking about. And then it goes back to the A. It goes back to that 14 bar phrase. And then it goes back to the B one more time, that ba-da-ba-da-ba, and then finishes out the song, okay? And that's where the solos start, okay? So that gives me a lot just right off the bat. Another thing is I'm paying attention to the rhythm section vibe, right? So it's very driving, right? It's very like, it's not like Tony Williams or Elvin where it's super broken, but it is pretty aggressive. I would say this is kind of like, hard bop or post bop, maybe leaning a little more post bop where it's kind of aggressive. So if I was playing on this tune, I would want to play some like straight ahead vocabulary, but don't go too far with it, okay? Another thing I notice is the rhythm section, they will imitate, the sections, right? So the very first section, right? It's kind of driving, and the pianist is kind of comping, like kind of punchy. I want to listen more actually to that. And then in the B sections, there's these fills. And the bass is kind of going between two chords, okay? So that should tell you a lot. That tells you like, boom, like I just know so much about the character of the song. I know the form, I know the general rhythm section vibe. I told you a little bit about the melody vibe too, where there's sequences, where it's more rhythmic, where it's more linear, right? And that's going to tell me a lot about the character of this tune. Now what we're going to do is we're going to listen to the first chorus of solo, and we're going to listen to it a bunch of times actually. And we're going to focus on one instrument at a time, okay? So the first one that we're going to focus on is, we're drummers, we're going to focus on the drums first. Let's listen to the drums and see what we notice. Okay, cool. That's the first chorus of the solo. Bunch of things that I heard, okay? And when I'm listening, I will listen for a lot of things at once, okay? Because I'm just curious. I just want to know about the music, right? So, you're gonna hear some things that are everything from details to bigger picture things, okay? First thing I notice is the cymbals that he's playing sound very thin. It's maybe like it feels like it's like either an 18 or a 20. Maybe it's like a old 60s A or a 60s K or something in that range. Very thin sounding. It's not one of these big nasty cymbals. It's not a Tony Williams K, it's got a little bit of a thinner sound. I also noticed the hi-hats sound super, super thin. He kept doing a couple of these hi-hat releases. I actually just filmed a Philly Joe Jones video before this, and he played this Philly idea that I was talking about in this boom, right? He played that at the top pretty much of every A section. Drummer on this, by the way, is Al Harewood, very great drummer. But he played that. A lot of his ride cymbal feel, he wasn't breaking up a lot. Even a lot of it was literally just quarter notes, right? But it's very aggressive. Al Harewood, Bob Cranshaw on bass, he's got a very driving bass feel. So they're really pushing the time forward. That makes a lot of sense with Grant Green's playing. He's very like on top of the beat. Another thing that I noticed was how Mr. Harewood here comped in the different sections, okay? The melody, if you remember, it has these hits on the end of four. And a lot of the time, Al Harewood was really honoring that in those sections. What I noticed in the first B section, the ba-da-ba-da-da, he kind of set up a little motif, a little repetition, right? He went boo-ka-goo-ka-goo, 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 right? And that makes a lot of sense with like the way the song is structured, right? The B section is more of like this, whereas like the A and the C are a little bit more linear, like I was talking about earlier, right? So that's how Al Harewood is interacting with the form of this song. When he gets to the B section where it settles a little bit more, he uses repetition to match that. And then when it gets back to those kind of, those A sections with the and of fours, he goes for those. I noticed in the C section that there was like longer phrases. It felt like 4-bar phrases to me. And that him and the pianist were kind of catching the and of four at the end of 4-bar phrases. Okay. So those are the main thing I noticed. Another thing I'll say real quick is like the general vocab. He's like in sort of like eighth note land. There was a couple of triplets on the last B section. He had these those kind of ideas. It felt like he was going for another like repetition thing, kind of like he did in the first B section, but that it ended up being a little more abstract than just like a pure repetition. Okay. And you'll hear that. These guys aren't, they're not following strict rules. It's a general vibe. They're probably just moving through their intuition with the structure of how the song is. Okay. That's the first pass. I heard a lot of stuff, right? But that was listening to literally just the drums. There's so much I can learn by listening to the other instruments, okay? So I'm going to listen again. I'm going to listen to just the piano this time, okay? And same thing, just try to see what I hear. By the way, if you're not using headphones, I recommend you do that. It's going to get harder as we listen to like the piano and the bass. You should probably be using headphones. Let's go to the next one. Yeah, okay. Man, so cool. I love pianists. Man, so many things I noticed there, okay? So the very first thing I noticed is at the beginning of the solo in the A section, he was doing a pretty stable mix of long notes and short notes, okay? So Duke Pearson, by the way, on piano here, it was very like, I would say like kind of default mode of comping where there's ba 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 da ba 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 ba, 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 right? A good mix of short notes and long notes, okay? I noticed when it got to the B section, it felt a little bit more like everything was a medium length note. Ba, 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 which makes sense, kind of in that B section where it sits a little bit. It goes between two chords, and there's those hits in the melody, right? It makes sense for him to kind of like shorten up the note values maybe a little bit. And then in the C section, where it's kind of more driving, he went back to that more open comping feel, mixing short notes and long notes. One thing I did notice, this is kind of fancy. I noticed at the beginning, maybe the first 8 bars or so, something like that, his voicings were very close together. They felt like smaller and thinner. And then around like 8 bars later, he opened it up so that it felt more like big, right? So that's how he's escalating the solo as the solo goes on. When it got to the last B section, again, I heard some more rhythmic stuff. I heard some stuff that was maybe building a little bit of tension, maybe going over the bar line a little bit. And then I heard like some big da-boom, like he dropped in a couple bass notes. It was either near the end of the C section or the end of the last B section. And that's kind of like a, here we, that kind of thing. And then the top of the second chorus, big release, right? In two ways. It was the longest note he had played up to that point, right? That tells me something as a drummer. I'm gonna do a big release with him. He did like gaga, I believe it was and a 4. And then the other thing is, I believe it was the highest note he had played up to that point as well. I think the voicing that he was probably playing, Duke Pearson on this, something where it was like, voice in the left hand, maybe something clustery, and then maybe like an octave here, or just something more spread out, okay? So again, I'm hearing how this pianist is interacting with the form in the soloist by using the tools that they have. Not just me listening to the drums and, oh, I got some licks from this song and, oh, I know the form so I don't get lost. No, that's like table stakes. You need to understand how the other musicians are interacting with the music so that you can interact with them. And like not just understand it if you think really hard. If I was playing on a gig, I would just do all this without thinking about it, right? I can sit here and break it down because I'm a teacher and I want to help you. But like on a gig, I just feel it, I just can tell all this stuff is happening without even really articulating it. Now, so far we've stayed within the rhythm section. We've done drums, we've done piano. I want to do the guitarist now because that's one of the biggest things you're going to be doing is how do I interact with the soloist? Okay, so let's listen, see what kind of lines Mr. Grant Green here is playing. All right, that's sick. All right. Grant Green. Wow. Okay, so here's a bunch of things that I noticed. The first thing I want to point out is the phrasing. Okay, so in the first part of the song, the 14 bar A section that kind of goes back and forth between two chords, he kind of phrases in 2 bar phrases. Zip, bo, zodi, bo, de, bo, zodi, bo, di, ba, da, ba, do, ba, da, do, ba, da. Right? I'm not singing his exact solo, but that's kind of the cadence. That's the phrasing of his solo, right? And it makes sense because it matches that A section, which is more like this chord, this chord, this chord, right? This is why phrasing is so important, you guys. This is how all the musicians in the band are interacting with the music. That's why when I talk about melody mapping in the other videos, like, it's not just a thing that I made up, right? It's something that you need for every single moment that you play jazz music, okay? Then when he gets to the B section, he kind of changes his vocabulary. In the A sections, it's more like rhythmic and kind of broken up. Bep, bop, zidable, beep, bop, zidopo, babo, bado, bodo, zickle, boop, boop, bop, boop, badum, diddle, boop, badum, boop, badum, boop, badum, right? In the B sections, he goes like it's bluesy, right? So I know in those B sections, it's kind of like a pedal where it stays on one chord. And he just, like, ignores the chord changes and just plays the blues over it, baby. So and the interesting thing is he does that for both B sections. So I know that that's kind of like his approach. For me, as a drummer, because I know that Al Harewood did, like, some repetition over those pedal points, and then the soloist played something bluesy, do you see how all of those things interact? So whenever I'm at a jam session and somebody starts playing a pedal point, and then somebody else starts playing something bluesy over the pedal point, I know it's time for me to set up some repetition, right? It's time for me, and I'll just intuitively go there because I've heard that pattern so many times in so many different recordings, right? Another thing I noticed is when we got to the C section, remember I said earlier, the C section is kind of linear. The chords are changing kind of constantly. And I noticed what Grant Green did here is he goes beep zop zodo bodo bodo yo boda bodo bodo yo bodo yo boda bo zodo bodo bodo bo bodo bo bodo bo bodo bodo de bodo yo bodo bodo bodo. He plays more eighth notes and he does these little turns, right? This is what we call bebop vocabulary. There's like a certain way to play it if you're a harmonic player, but it's very linear. It's these lines, these windy, snaky lines that you hear horn players play all the time. And the reason that he plays those, you hear horn players play that over chord changes that are more like constantly changing rather than staying the same like the pedal point. The pedal point, blues, right? That's what he does. And then it goes back to the A section. He this time it's interesting, he starts by playing a little bit more rhythmically like he did the first time in the A section, but then he kind of mixes in some of that bebop, some of that linear stuff. So it's kind of like he escalated from the first A section where it's just rhythmic to the second A section, it's rhythmic and some linear stuff in there. Okay? So you can hear it building and I'm following along with, oh, that's why he chose that, right? I want to know how the other players are interacting with the song so that I know how to interact with them. Right? And then the last thing I noticed, oh, the last B section, again, he went to that more kind of bluesy feel. Okay. So you hear that, like, just from listening to it, what do we do? 3 times? I know how is the drummer playing? What kind of vocabulary do you play on this song? How is the guitar player, the soloist interacting with this song? How is the pianist interacting with the song and the drummer and the guitarist, right? And how do those 3 things mix together? And then when I go on the bandstand, that's why I'm going to be inside on the joke, man, because I know how these things work. I know what everybody else is doing. And instead of thinking about me and how good I am at my instrument, I'm thinking about them, man. I'm thinking about what they're trying to do with their thing and what we're making together. And that's why layered listening is so important. You need to listen to music like a jazz musician who wants to serve the music and the people that he's playing with. Here's the steps to do layered listening on your own now that you've done it here with me. Step 1, listen through it, general, first pass, no limitations, right? Get the vibe like I did with the form and all that stuff. Second pass, listen to just the drums. You're a drummer, listen to the drums. Then go through each instrument, right? Once you go through a couple different instruments, you're going to start to see some patterns of how they interact with the form. And then you can take it a level further and you can say, I'm going to listen to just the bass and just the drums together. How do they interact with each other? What does the pianist do when the drummer does this, right? Once you do this, you're going to finally understand how to interact with other jazz musicians because you actually listen to all the other players on the record. If you found this interesting, you're probably going to love my video that takes it one step further, where I actually transcribe some Philly Joe Jones live on the video. If you want to watch that, just click here.